Now sharing. Okay, I see. Right. So to begin then, basically, what we have here is a pause on everyday capitalism, and it's highlighted for many of us some exciting civic values and public services, social solidarity, the clapping for NHS, even while it's wreaked havoc with our industry cash flows and public services. And so, that's been something that's been a real, really a notable feature of the entire experience for us. And so it, so it leads to the question: what comes next? What can we change? We won't go back to the way things were. And for this, we'll, as I say, put a frame, and then what we'll do is we'll take a look at what history can teach us, and then try to look forward. And we'll look at some sort of very quickly at some diverse elements of history. Okay, now first of all, the pandemic lockdown is actually an economic cardiac arrest. It's wreaked havoc on employment, income flows, sales, and revenues. Here's the latest charts from the Bank of England. They do this quarterly report called the Monetary Policy Report, available online, very well worth getting, very nice report. Lots of the information here is going to be taken from that. And what you can literally see here is GDP falling off the cliff, unemployment rising precipitously, and price inflation changing as well. And here's other indicators of all the different aspects of everyday life. These are some of the things that can be measured on a sort of big data scale. Airport departures, motor vehicle traffic, Google searches for cars, retail, football. All these things are just going down precipitously fast, and not surprising. So basically, is it on to these blue skies that we've been enjoying and to this new tomorrow? On the one hand, this COVID crisis shows us, what really matters: the NHS, collective action, social solidarity, community, and family. And there's many unexpected gains. I think the air is nice. There's a sort of slower pace of everyday life in a certain way. We can have time for exercise and enjoy one another's home-cooked food. And these are things that we would like to keep as we contemplate this post-COVID pandemic world. But can we jump right into this more inevitable post-capitalism? So if, as the cliche has it, if it's a question of never letting a crisis go to waste, well, how can we imagine this? Here's a kind of simple graphic just to suggest what we might imagine, and especially this is kind of tilted toward thinking about sustainability and thinking about equity and solidarity. We want more circular economies. We want less things from outside. We'd like more meaningful and clean work and less repetitive, dirty work. We'd like less focus on economic value, more on social value, more equity, less inequality, more solidarity, and less exercise of power. So essentially, we want to move the dial from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And so let's do it, like community by community. Let's do it as neighbors. And I forgot to highlight on the previous slide the book by Paul Mason, Post-Capitalism. Came out in 2015, and Mason argued that it's basically literally a click away that we're entering the post-material economy. Well, I'd say, not so simple. We can't move as neighbors, because whilst our neighborhoods, as are around us, hidden in that is that we're within a system that's mostly not visible to us, and we have to make this visible and make visible the economic constraints that are at work. And these are some of the kinds of things that you're starting to hear as we make this transition from the lockdown economy, much well supported, to the realities that are going to confront us. Now, the first thing is to say that on that left-hand side, we had these values like circularity, social solidarity of smaller communities. But we have to realize that basically, first of all, any community economy, any small economy, requires injections of cash. We're going to get to that in a minute, that the smaller economy depends on the larger entities surrounding it. And this economy, at present, we are in a global capitalist system. And, without sort of quoting chapter and verse on Karl Marx, basically, this is a system in which most assets are owned privately. Private assets are expected to hold their value and earn a return, and those who own them have the right to deploy them and to deploy their wealth as they wish. And the basis of a return is the surplus that's generated in producing goods and services, and the basis of gains from asset trading or asset holding. So there's kind of tension once as a system is up and running, like a mature system as we have, between, for those who own the capital, who own the wealth, between investing the surplus that they earn in current production, putting into practice, into place. And on the other hand, the other part of the tension is if you're not sure you can do that, you would want to stay liquid and protect your accumulated gains. If you invest, you're committing to an area, you're buying plant and equipment. The other option is to pull back from that. So keeping things going means maintaining the confidence of those who've got the capitalist confidence, and that in turn means not challenging control over the system, that is their power. Now, the other part of the realities we have to confront is that everything occurs in space. And here's just a depiction just to sort of allow you to note that you can scope out from the very local, from you yourself, to your household, neighborhood, city, region, globe. And, essentially everything is spatial. And what this means is that every spatial area, no matter how big or small it is, has to pay for what it buys from the rest of the world, either by selling goods and services to the rest of the world, or drawing down its assets, or attracting in capital. And basically, this means having a positive relationship with the units and the entities in the surrounding environment, whether they're public or private. And so a region depends on the nation, towns depend on the region. A depressed national economy can rebuild itself through trade only if its national trading partners are not themselves depressed. And so, we have this problem now that you'll see in the next slide, where often a nation can be pulled out of a downturn by more prosperous nations, but now nobody's more prosperous. This goes all the way down the line and is one of our major problems now. I won't spare you, I'll spare you the detail on this. This is a picture, again, from the Bank of England, I think in this case, that essentially looks at it's from the OECD, sorry, that shows you the expected negative hits on economies. And these are most of the major economies, I think those in the OECD. And you'll see it goes from a best performance of 15% hit Ireland down to more like a 34% hit in Greece. So everyone is down. And so essentially, we have this thing that, money talks. If we're going to try to make a border, let's go back to that initial vision of coming up with a more circular, more cooperative economy, isolated from the rest of the world. Well, to do that, we've got to resource our economy. We need new firms and financing to make it happen. So either we do this by sustaining capitalism, or we secure enough resources that we can move out of capitalism in the way that, say, Paul Mason suggested, or suspending it, replacing it, and so there, and or so on. Now, to do this, we need some first principles. We need some real world plans. And the first challenge we face is, who is the we? Where do we draw this circle, as I had from the other graph, around us? Is it the neighborhood, the city, the region, the nation? With whom are we in solidarity? Our neighbors, our citizens, everyone? And then, we might be able to imagine social prices and exchanges amongst ourselves. But basically, anything that goes across borders that's not amongst us must involve trade, monetary values for trade. So how do we do this? What do we want? And this goes to this question is really posed. Now here there's some really interesting answers that are emerging, and I've been working with my colleague from the economics division, Andy Brown, and with others on one possibility is to think about systems of provision. Ben Fine also got involved with that. Then there's ideas of that came out of Manchester about the foundational economy, and our own Dan O'Neill from the Earth and Environment School talks about, can we define how enough is enough? Well, beyond that, what do we decide? How do we make this happen? If we want to have use values for a living to replace exchange values, we need a point of agreement. We need somewhere of drawing the line, of deciding, for example, yeah, let's have a jointly funded, cross-subsidized NHS, because if we don't, we're going to have to turn to the private markets. So, the we there, this is a key question. Defining this it really brings the problematic of democratic voice and a control point for democratic voice right into the center of things. And, the more tightly we define the we, then the easier it is to achieve consensus or to even figure out how to have a coherent vote about our choice. But as we have that more coherent, smaller community, then the less resource we command. So as we enlarge this space, we're encompassing more resource potential, but compromising democratic voice. So we have this problem that we have to solve, and basically, we'll either need to be in a system where we'll be able to sell what we need, or to draw resources in, to attract investment, or to have a redistribution system that will allow things to work. Now, obviously, one of the points that's been made quite dramatically is about this question of we is really challenged by the presence of residential segregation that has led to disproportionate. Turn off your. Yeah, someone's got their mic on. Thank you. And we've got this problem of sort of concentration of risk, and that it sort of shows the fact that this has become an issue is good. It shows that we're willing and able to think about how to overcome some of these problems, but these challenges are in front of us, because to buy time to make these new choices, to have this collective choice for us, we need the policy space. And policy space means you've got the financial slack and the time and money, where you or your appointed decision makers can use that space to make transformative investments. So, which levels can do that? Well, with our devolution idea, we decided that, well, localities should have that slack. There should be some transfers on the national level, and in fact, that has to involve transfers from richer to poorer areas within the nation. That's the only way you can get toward equity, is to level up by leveling across first. Now, nations can do that perhaps because nations can typically, create resources. But essentially, there's different ways that nations can do that. They can raise taxes, they can sell to the rest of the world, they can borrow in their own currency, they can sell public debt, they can borrow another currency, they can borrow from another country, or their central bank can print the money to actually pay for the services the government wants. That's called monetary financing, and that's something that's been called modern monetary theory. We'll leave that aside for the minute, but let's go now to history. When has there been policy space, and for what? A couple of examples here. One is, from World War I, that was funded in part by borrowing from Wall Street. Then we had the episode after that of the Great Depression. Then we had World War II, again, borrowing money from Wall Street, that relationship there. That was followed by actually a post-war recovery in which there were collective decisions made, even as Great Britain faced the post-hegemonic period that was, that rang in with the coming of those two wars. And we entered into something called the golden age of capitalism. And part of what made it a golden age was the provision of new adequate social welfare services, notably the NHS, paid maternity leave, all embodied in the Beveridge Report, which actually came out during the war, 1942, as Britons were struggling, and trying to survive. Now, unfortunately, when we turn to what happened with our last major crisis, that's the subprime boom, and once again, that followed by the crisis. Now, that crisis was profound everywhere, including here. And in the case of the UK, I won't talk about the US. What happened was, assets were bought on Wall Street by often large banks. The crisis comes, they get into trouble. Those three in particular, Lloyd's, HBOS, and RBS, became insolvent. And actually, what happens next is, well, not so much a good story. This is what happened was depicted in a graphic slide put together by Professor Jagjit Chadha, who runs the National Institute for Economic and Social Research down in London. And he shows you, this is a graph of debt as a share, public debt as a share of gross domestic product, GDP, for the UK. And you can see that literally in a day in 2008, November, that the national debt more than doubled. That was about basically paying for the bailout of those banks, and that, of course, rang in the austerity period. Now, we've got now a problem, and the reason we had that solution in 2008 was that we're out of the global age of capitalism, and we now have a new type of capitalism, which is we've had since more or less the 80s, the time of global finance. And we have this capitalism, we have it now is organized on two principles. There's the global mobility of money, production and finance, and the second is that there's been the exorbitant privilege, the special role of the US dollar. It is uniquely the safe haven asset and is used as a reserve asset. So it's led to this imbalanced global structure where the US economy has lived beyond its means for all these years, since the 80s. And there's been a huge trade deficit. And meanwhile, the rest of the world has had a trade surplus that it's lived off of. And in exchange for that, they've bought US financial assets. You can see it's a kind of Frankenstein monster in the sense that the rest of the world buys more and more US financial assets that feeds Wall Street more and more, which leads to the widening income inequality globally, which then feeds and validates this imbalance and makes the US safer and safer because only the US Federal Reserve has enough capacity to really save the system when it wobbles. Now, meanwhile, every unit everywhere has to balance everything, and there's more and more money made and more debt out in the system. Here's a picture just to show you. There's on the bottom is the trade deficit of the U.S. over the years, and that's compensated for the net capital inflows into the U.S. on the other side. So there's your global structure of your economy. Meanwhile, compensating that because the U.S. is the safe haven, it's been the safe place with that powerful central bank. More and more reserve holdings go into the dollar. The dollar is held more than anything else. There's your imbalance. Now, what the COVID-19 broke, we already had this world of imbalances with all the units doing their best to support their expenditures, service their debts, whether they're nations or firms or households, but everyone in general doing it with a very fine margin. And then the UK, for example, turning to the UK, turns to things, and the crisis breaks it. It makes a quintuple hit. It hits aggregate supply and demand, destroys people's income, forces people to borrow. It leads to destroying asset values, and leads to a global run to safety that weakens the pound relative to the dollar. Now, the Bank of England tries to support the financial system, and meanwhile, the Treasury steps in to support some of us. And this is a couple of graphs. I'll be quick here, but just to say, it's getting bigger here. These are the ways that people are borrowing more, even in the weeks since the crisis has come. And the other picture shows you that banks' ability to lend is tighter and tighter. And basically, what was already broke when the COVID-19 came and broke it more is the global economy. The big takeaway here is that, we have to find more economic resources to return to the status quo ante, much less transforming it. To make the circular economy, we need the resource and the time to transform it. But globally, things are tighter. There's no coherent plan for global growth or sustainability, and the economic future was already bleak, both for advanced countries and then for the developing countries. For the advanced economies, first of all, you see here they are, they're growing less quickly than the rest of the world. And meanwhile, the developing economies are pulling the advanced economies along until they break with the crisis in that part of the world. And this kind of global imbalance has all been made worse by the Brexit and the euro problems as well. There's a picture that just shows you that here's the UK foreign exchange rate compared to the dollar going worse and worse. And basically, in the end, we're in a situation where all solutions are global. We have a situation where the crisis of the developing economies has gotten worse and worse. This is a picture from the UN, from UNCTAD, the UN, of the rising debt levels in the developing world. At the same time, the central banks, and particularly the Fed, the US Federal Reserve, have provided swap lines to support the economy, but they've already been deeply involved in underwriting global financial systems. That's what this quantitative easing is about. And they've given swap lines to support some of the emerging economies, but not all the emerging economies. So actually, there are numbers of very important developing economies, and I list them here, that do not have access to Federal Reserve swap lines. That is dollars. Turkey, Argentina, Indonesia, Egypt. These are places where the crisis is pitched to happen because they have no safety. The U.S. is not protecting them. And so the end of my story, unfortunately, is not a happy one. We need a global plan, and we need global capacity. These imbalances have hit us so fast and come so hard that all of our units, the nation state, the firm, the household, are all what Hyman Minsky used to call Ponzi units. Those are units where they have to borrow more money just to manage the debt they already have. The only option is to socialize them, to make them part of somehow a public trust. But how would that work? We don't have a plan for that. And so basically, the riskier things get around the world, the more heated is the run to safe haven assets. That means the dollar, despite everything, remains on top. You've seen that with the decline of the pound. Even though that, at the moment, the president of the nation issuing the dollar is burning his own country down while triggering a war with the rising nation of China. Now, there's nowhere to go but the nation states. We aren't organized on any other basis to work through all these chains, spatial chains of interdependencies. And none of this, keep in mind, is about stopping climate change or achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I was in the UN in November, and the number we had for doing those two things at that time was $4 trillion. At that point, 100 billions had been raised. We are nowhere near. We need a plan. We need a global plan. We need a global central bank. Otherwise, as we ease out of the COVID-19 into the post-COVID economy, there are possibly millions or billions of people whose very lives will be at stake. And the situation could not be more desperate. Thank you for your attention, and now let's open it up for questions.
Wow, gosh. I'm not sure what I was hoping for there, Gary, but I feel quite like that's an awful lot of information there to sort of to kind of capture in such a short space of time. Just picking up on your last point then about sort of the American politics and how that's playing into it. Where do you see that particular part going?
The U.S. politics, it's going to be a race between the kind of bitterness of Donald Trump and his effort to show that he's a strong man holding back the hordes, the masses, the people of color around the world, build that wall, and then in your inner city neighborhoods, in the LAs and in the New Yorks and so on, and whether he can consolidate his support, and show that there's no alternative to that strong leadership. At this point, it does seem that the Democrats are in the lead, but they are unable to campaign. They've got a candidate who is prone to make mistakes with his mouth. He's a little bit older and probably more physically fragile than Trump is, and Trump's machine is a lot more sophisticated and has a lot more money. So I fear that the election will be very close, despite all. And I do fear that we could see a transformation of the United States into something unrecognizable. But that's a process that's already underway in numbers of nations around the world, Brazil being at the very front of that list. So there's a lot of danger with that election. It has to be. I'm afraid to say that Donald Trump is not fit for purpose, to use the British phrase. We cannot abide another 4 years of that.
That's really so. One of the questions that we had on the sort of the pre-registration was around this kind of and thinking about kind of what happens if Trump is re-elected. But the question kind of then goes on to say, does the pandemic mean that there's going to become a disconnect between what the public have voted for, or our political ideas, and actual policy?
I think there will be a disconnect. I think that the public thinks that they're voting for the restoration of something that's in their minds from before, and this could be in those parts of the U.S. where Trump really won his victory were concentrated either the formerly industrial Midwest, or the retirement states, places like Arizona and Florida, which are full of retirees, remembering their past. And there's no way, actually, ironically, the trade war that Trump has been playing with China has the objective of encouraging the renewal of U.S. manufacturing, but that has to do with dinosauric industries that actually are being swept away by the tides of change even as we go, the automobile industry, etc. It's an impossible agenda. So people will not get what they voted for. And, if you really want to play a very bleak card, the only thing that will bring about anything like a strong demand push that can be sustained would be something like putting the economy on a warlike footing. Now, we need a war to sustain the planet. We need a declaration of a real sincere intent to become more circular and sustainable, to make that the equivalent of war. But I fear that Trump is in the pocket of lots of people who have other agendas and have very short-term objective functions.
Yeah, I think, well, there's a lot of questions coming through chat now, so if we can maybe sort of look at some of those. The David kicked off with, so where can we find hope and harmony in global economics at the moment? And there are a few questions here around what is it that we can do? So what can individuals do? Should we be buying British? What are the things that we should be looking for to try and help to solve some of these, or not solve, but to contribute positively to these issues?
I think that first of all, at the global scale, we have to find hope where we can. And actually, I decided not to talk more about the UK, or excuse me, the European situation, because as you saw, that my talk was already going to be packed. But what we have in Europe are some bold steps, which admittedly are less than sufficient. But we have Ursula von der Leyen, the first female leader of the European Union, who has stepped forward to try to work within the limits imposed by EU law in order to make progress and to keep that union together, to have people sharing resources and budgets across their border lines, and to try to make that work. And you know, she's brought Germany part of the way along. The battle is fierce, but people are afraid. That's a lot of the fear that you see in the European North. The fiscal four, you know, they're afraid to share, and they've been burned before, and all of that. But basically, that kind of, you know, let us, you know, work together. And of course, we saw this with the spirit that Angela Merkel brought to the refugee crisis some years ago, and then it was burned. There was a resurgence of right wing there. But we can't live in that world. We can't be there. So I think at that scale, I see Europe as actually a completely vital place right now. I would have hopes that as the smoke clears, that the UK on the Brexit mess, however that goes, when I suspect it will be, I think it's going to be a bumpy 18 months here. That as that smoke clears, I think we will see a renewed holding of hands across the channel, just for survival and for prosperity on both sides. We both have a lot to give each other. And let's hope by then we have at least a more reasonable U.S. government in place. We got to tone it down with the conflict with China and so on. At the individual level, I think basically the things that we can all do to transform our lives, every small step we take, the good we do our bodies when we keep ourselves in better shape, and therefore we'll need less servicing by drastic medical interventions as we age. The ways that we can reach out to neighbors who are different to us, the volunteering, the steps that we take to make more circular and more sustainable lives. You know what, you know, again, Dan O'Neill called enough is enough. And you know, this type of thing, I think at the human scale, it can feel like a small gesture of resistance to a world that otherwise seems to be saying no in every direction. I think that's been part of the power of the Thursday night clapping, has been the appreciation and the celebration of solidarity. We have to carry that forward into our everyday lives.
Yeah, that's a really nice. It's a nice thought to kind of come back to. I guess there's a couple of questions here around sort of socialism. So, you know, do you think that socialism is going to be an option as part of the potential solution? And also, you know, Jonathan has written a question here about, you know, so how are we going to convince current holders of accumulated capital to change their stranglehold on wealth towards a more balanced and fair economy? So I guess questions around how are we going to make this move into sort of the sharing of wealth a bit more fair?
There's, you know, there's a couple of things. One is that socialism is actually a word that's got a very funny history. It's got multiple connotations. I think when I was coming up in the U.S., if you talked about socialism, everyone would associate you with the Communist Party USA, and kind of, you know, then there'd be this turning to Stalin and some very dark moments in 20th century history. For the younger generation, I think a lot of what is now included in an agenda that would be called socialist looks a lot like an agenda that would be called social democratic, or even popular economics back in the mid 20th century. My former student Stefanos Iano, who's now at Oxford, he once pulled out the Conservative Party manifesto for, I think it was 1952 or 47. And actually, if you looked at that and then looked at the Labour Party manifesto, I think at that point it might have been 2014 or 15, they were quite similar. So there's been some evolution of what we mean. And I think it has to do in part with, now socialism in part means social sharing of capacity for well-being, of providing well-being to everyone regardless of their capacity to give. It has less to do with public resource, and I think there's huge debates about, should we turn back to public ownership of transport? Should we turn back? Should we turn, toward other forms of remaking state ownership in different sectors? The NHS certainly is an example of a sector that has been forced to adapt and has continued to maintain its excellence under all this pressure. And I can report to you that coming from a country that doesn't have that, the private provision of healthcare there it makes it almost impossible. My daughter just was laid off from work, and her big problem is that she now no longer has access to healthcare. She has to find it on her own, and that's very typical. That's the U.S. model. That's the part that's broken. Now, can we a huge debate in California in these years I was there and participated in the policy circles there was, can you do well? Can you do good while doing well? Can you turn capitalism for a good purpose? And I think, we're seeing, in a way, an argument. One side, there's Bill Gates, having made his millions from the Microsoft monopoly. And on the other hand, there's Mark Zuckerberg saying, no, I choose not to be accountable for anything that's happening. I think we need controls. The financial system is over-optimized for highly leveraged entities that are taking huge amounts of risk on small margins. We don't need to be in that world, but to be out of that world, we need a situation in which you cannot game the system by going outside it. So we're going to need global action on tax havens. We're going to need global action for that's more than just soft law, but it looks more like hard law. And it's not enough to have large capital in the banks, because as we could readily show, I don't care how much capital these big banks have, they're capable of over leveraging and breaking that system, especially once they feel. And an example here was the leveraged loan market. If you haven't heard of that, look up leveraged loans, and you'll see that given enough time, that will become as big a crisis as the subprime. And that loan market is premised on making loans to companies whose balance sheets are broken. That's exactly the kind of companies that are going to be all around the world right now. And we don't need predatory lending to those kinds of companies. But it's going to take, I fear, effective global action. And I don't know what that means. And I confess, that's where I'm stuck right now. How do we do that?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, that. There's a question around debt. Well, in fact, there's several questions around debt here, and it might be worth picking those up together. So particularly here, so Roland's asking, is debt the only way out of the pandemic? And he's got some questions about kind of how much is needed, particularly given climate and climate impact and things like that. But also there are questions further down then. So, how can we actually reduce the cost and impact of government debt? So are we going to get more? How can we make it less impactful?
Yeah, let me come to Roland's question and let me say one more thing. I think it is possible. Okay, so if we can't go for a neutral, fair, just system of global financial governance, could it be that the City of London, post-Brexit, could position itself to be that financial center that offers socially responsible, sustainable contracts to guard against risk without allowing over-optimization? Could we do that and basically attract in capital that's tired of being burned, especially as governments, save for the United States, lose the capacity to pay for that? That's a question, it's a thought. Okay, on to debt. Actually, yeah, I mean, it's argued by the modern monetary theorists that if you do, and others now, and in fact, that monetary financing, where essentially the central government the central bank basically makes the money, puts the money in the accounts, and then the government spends it. That's monetary finance is when you don't bother issuing a debt instrument and then having the central bank buy it, which then releases the central bank reserves to the government that puts it in people's bank accounts, or whoever, however it gets spent. And so one answer that's given by MMT proponents and increasingly others is let's just do monetary finance. The argument goes, if there are surplus resources, people who won't otherwise be employed, then what's the harm? You would buy goods if you could. You don't have a job, you can't unless you go into awful debt. And therefore, by the government giving you a job, or paying a firm to give you a job, then you have the means to pay for your own employment. That's the argument. It hinges on having a currency that issued without any fear by the entity, by the central bank in question. And I would argue that only the United States is clearly in that position at this point. The UK is not a target of global predation, so we've got some policy space, but not as policy space as they do in the United States for reasons, as I mentioned, that are structural. Now that leads us to the question of what else is there if not debt? Now here's where there's something we used to talk about in some of the affordable housing debates in the US. Could we not imagine that people who, for example, were unable to service their mortgages could basically ask for the government to have a part equity ownership of their home? Okay, just a thought. As such, would that turn that house into partly a public good that could perhaps be available for others once that household was done on an affordable basis? Right, you can start to think of, would there be a public interest or some public good that's, such as providing shelter, that would be given by particular classes of asset? Could then unpayable debt be replaced by equity claims that come from a public source? Okay, that's a thought. Now, if you go from that to think it's not just going to be households facing debt, it's going to be small business right now. Again, a slide I didn't have time to show was going to show that banks are really wondering if they're going to be able, and in fact, they're kind of failing to make sufficient credit available to the small and medium enterprises right now. So do we then say, all right, we'll take an equity position in your business? Okay, witnesses, what's your criterion? Well, that you employ people? Well, that you should be employing people. So is it about what you do, right? Where do you draw that line? Then you say, well, wait a minute, aren't we already doing that for the airline industry and for other industries that are somehow seem to be strategically important for national purposes? Well, all right, well, how about the high street? How about the mom and pop stores in small towns? So you can see that equity positioning and shared equity ownership is another possible source. But notice that at the root of that, you need some economic unit. And again, I say there's no substitute right now for the nation state or some kind of fund that is and has that characteristic to step in and provide that means of payment, because that's what you're doing. You're swapping debt or equity for debt, and you need to make that initial transaction to make that work. That's really worthy of very, very careful investigation at this point. Could one come up with a criterion and so on? I mean, this is leaving aside recreating what have been some for-profit companies into co-ops and so on. My experience with small business is that all small business in general operates on a very small margin. Some of them have been pushed over the edge already, and we've got a huge problem there of what to do with that now, what could be idle capital, idle places, idle stores, and less than thriving high streets all across the nation.
Yeah, and that's would that apply to larger companies as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They've got different, as they have different levels of global scope, they're positioned differently. You know, business services have been big in the UK, and we saw, I think it was KPMG, one of the big ones, I forget which, recently let it be known that they were going to furlough or lay off a good percentage of their workers as they were preparing for a dial down in the level of services that they were anticipating. And that's a global problem. HSBC has a global problem now that they're solving. I think they're going to close their U.S. branches completely. All their operations, I think, are going to go. Of course, that hits the U.S., but that will certainly have implications for their headquarters staff in London and elsewhere across the UK, including Leeds, you know, and Manchester and so on. So I think the bigger companies, and again, we can ask the question, well, do we have a national interest in sustaining a global presence for our City of London industry, the one that famously speaks your language? Well, what public purposes are being served by that? Is it part of the UK strategic interest? And there's where we can see that there has not been a solution. They tried to make the argument for the government tried to say, let us be the westward-facing hub for the Chinese-centered new global, sort of, presence in the system. That didn't really work out. So are we still going to be able to service and be Europe's front line for providing some of the global services? That's completely unclear. The negotiations with Barnier are going very badly in terms of passporting for that sector. So, we've got to look forward strategically with a double vision there of what we save and why.
Great. Okay. So, well, I think that answers Catherine's question at the end there as well. So let's talk about what's going to go forward from this point. So a couple of questions are kind of where we're going with this. So particularly, there's one about Germany. Does that mean that Germany are pushing us to go back to the sort of the state of imbalance because that's what their economic model is based on? And another question here about, well, if that's where we're going, does that give an opportunity for China to become the new sort of global player in this? Or is that going to be the sort of system we end up with?
Boy, okay, let's go with Germany and then China. Yeah, Germany is a fascinating model, of course. Actually, we've got a PhD student. We were talking with him just last night on whether Germany's resurgence can be attributed more to the quality of their exports and thus the sustained ability of Germany to retain a disciplined workforce, good communication, good corporate habits, multiply centered economy that is based on locally grounded units that work together to make stuff that's globally fit? Or is Germany as what it is because it came into the Eurozone and has been able to use what was essentially an undervalued mark, or what would have been a mark, to basically sell to the rest of Europe and build its economic strength? Varoufakis has argued the latter point. Others would argue the former point. But Germany's resurgence is based ultimately on European vibrancy. That's at risk. And it's also been based on trading with China, and it has a lot to do with the automobile industry. There's a continual tug of war over intellectual property with China, with all of its trading partners, as they've moved up the value chain. And the precious jewels of German industry, which ultimately go to the machine tooling and the some of the very high-end production capability and quality capabilities, are at risk in this environment. And I think that the Germans know that. And while there is pride that they've set aside money, and that's part of, I think, trying to protect their government capacity, and they can do this crisis, the COVID, without breaking a sweat in a certain way, that's all actually a fear of facing the future that could be a lot darker, especially if Europe falls apart, which is quite possible. as the political conditions for sustaining it difficult. Turning to China for a couple minutes, let's just say that with China, what we have is a situation of a country that primarily is trying to meet the expectations of its own population, first and foremost. It's been successful. It's been at huge cost to the environment, and it's been at huge cost to the sort of the possibility for democratic voice. That kind of goes to that issue, right? Of, well, one way to get rid of the global financial speculation, in principle, would be to make it a Chinese world banking system. I don't know if you want to think about that. That would be a strange future. But more to the point, China's initial foray was to build out the European land road through the Belt and Road Initiative, and it first of all gave a place to invest, to create the demand for what it was capable of making, keeping its workers working. It spread the infrastructure construction out across to Africa, Central Asia, etc. But what's turned out is that actually there was never much interest in at this stage on China's own banks taking on that kind of debt in the way that, say, had been done in Latin America or East Asia in earlier episodes by Western banks. They didn't want to take that risk. Instead, it was local countries and local agencies that were taking on that risk, and that risk has gone very badly. So the Chinese experiment in building out Belt and Road, and only partly with its own financing, is almost pretty much a failure at this point. So how they go from here, that is yet to be seen. And I should say, China insists they do not want to be the center of a hegemonic system. They would like to see something more like what I've described there, a global central bank. And I think that they have consistently, since the crisis of 2009, the last two heads of the People's Bank of China, their central bank, have consistently said, we need a global system. We don't want this to be a renminbi hegemonic world. So sooner or later, I think we're going to get there, but it is a race with time in terms of the human dislocations and the ecological damage that we're doing whilst we have not figured out how to be a sustainable planet.
Yeah. I mean, I've got lots of questions, but there's still some more in the chat for us to get through, and we are going to run to time, I think. So whilst I will ask you for some closing comments in a minute, but perhaps we could just do some very, very brief answers for these. So one is, have the opportunity cost of Brexit increased due to the pandemic?
Yes, because essentially what we have is there would certainly be the capacity for companies on both sides of the European border, and keep in mind how much we trade, to sustain relationships. A lot of our manufacturing, still important, is linked to global value chains that link into Europe. And as those companies' business is down, the health of our economy is down. And so that slowdown, that global 30% slowdown, insofar as it weakens us and weakens even the continent we're trying to pull away from politically, is going to make it, there's going to be less resource to work with. That policy space is going to be cleared. And for example, the devolution agenda and the leveling up agenda is really in trouble.
Great. And then another couple of questions, if we can fit them in. I know we're going to run to time really quickly, but so some interest here in, should we be looking towards the Nordic model, some sort of universal basic income?
I think UBI, I think, is problematic when we have voters who are suspicious of the legitimacy of the rights of people who live within their national borders who are not citizens. And I think, Switzerland's negative vote on UBI showed that. Now the Swiss are conservative people, so to speak. But I think that the Nordic solution there is also, it succeeds to the extent that everybody is seen as a member of a commonly held community. I think that gets more complicated as we move south. And so I think that people crossing borders makes a problem for defining stable communities in which people are happy to share. So I'm afraid I don't see it as being something that would be sustainable at a national level. Now, whether we can imagine a UBI solution that's more localized, that's something different. And I would encourage localized UBI solutions to see how it might work before we try anything more grand.
Okay. So one last thing that we'll just squeeze in before we finish. A question from a little bit earlier, which I had missed in the chat here. So a question says about the definition of we in gathering the resources needed for financing future initiatives. Are we moving towards micro financial groups rather than bigger corporations for such purposes?
No, I think what we're seeing at this point is sort of ecologies of finance that are grouped around the mega banks. Those battles between European and US mega banks have been securely won by Wall Street. And at this point, the smaller groups are taking largely boutique positions within the whole. Again, we can think of cooperative models, but we have to imagine re-engineering all the linkages between retirement funds, investment funds, private equity funds, and so on, in ways that are going to build toward a different alternative. We need to replace the short-term principle with a longer term and the more social principle. To do that, we have to do more to build toward alternative theories of value. And maybe if I might just say a word to conclude, would that be about the time?
I was just going to invite you to do so. We have 1 minute left, Gary. So over to you for concluding remarks.
The concluding remark would be just this. For all those listening who are students or studying this, first of all, we need every mind. If you are already a professional in the business sector, in university, elsewhere, if you want to get involved, please get in touch. If you are a student and you're thinking of whether you want to take on some of these thoughts in your thesis or dissertation work, again, take up the challenge. This is a time of immense creativity is needed to solve problems that have never been so vitally important for every single person on this planet. So thank you so much for your time today.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Gary. So on behalf of all the participants, thank you for such a wonderful talk. Shocking in some places, but lots of lovely focus on the future as well, which is great. And thanks very much to all of you that participated. Lots and lots of questions. I hope we try to gather them together as much as we possibly could to get through them all. And there you can see lots of thank yous for you, Gary. And it was great to have you all here. Perfectly timed. It is 5 o'clock, so I will say thank you ever so much and goodbye. We don't close this session down for you all, so you all are invited to exit whenever you are ready. There is a hand